China has built like a fort in, Sri Lanka, or they're leasing it for 99 years in return for forgiving their debts. And I was just wondering what India's, are they kind of like annoyed at Sri Lanka, or Sri Lanka and India's about to get on? Or does that worry them that China is kind of on both sides now?
Right, so we have been seeing across the Indian Ocean China investing very heavily in port infrastructure. Many cases, these are Chinese private corporations. They are building container ports that facilitate trade. So on the surface, it looks non-threatening. So it benefits everybody. Again, the concerns that India has had with Belt and Road relate very directly to this. There are questions about sometimes the financing and ownership of and the terms of those deals. So many cases there are very high interest rates associated with them, which the local governments ignore initially, and it only comes to light after the government changes hands. In other cases, on paper the ownership is a commercial entity, but there's actually a government backing, Chinese government backing for it. To date, only one port is actually a military base, which is in Djibouti, in East Africa. So that's China's first official overseas military facility. A second one in Gwadar, which is in Pakistan, is right now, it's still not technically a military facility, but it is an enclave. It's been, locals are not allowed to go in. It's basically a Chinese enclave. And there's a belief that it will very soon become a military facility as well. In Sri Lanka, there were attempts, so there are two ports that China has invested in, one in Colombo and one in Hambantota, which is right in the south of Sri Lanka. And these largely came up during the previous government, Sri Lankan government under President Rajapaksa. Sri Lanka incurred a great deal of debt associated with this. And we even saw a Chinese submarine dock at Colombo and one of the bases. And that set off a great deal of concern because it was very overtly being used now for military purposes. There's no longer this fiction that it was only going to be used for commercial purposes. We had then a change in government in Sri Lanka, and the new government, which again was generally more positively disposed towards India, uncovered that there was a much greater debt that the government had taken on, and it had a real trouble financing that debt. And particularly the second port, not Colombo, but Hambantota, is seen as a bit of a white elephant. It's not near very much. It's the home constituency of the previous president, so he was doing it obviously for political purposes too. And so how to get out of that was really a big problem. And so I think this agreement to lease it for 99 years was kind of the way out for that. The Sri Lankan government has given assurances to the Indian government that it will not be used for military purposes. And there are reasons for now to believe that it will abide by that. But whether it can enforce it will remain to be seen. And I think so I think we will see they're keeping a watchful eye on that port. But ostensibly, officially, it is not being used for military purposes.
And the relationship between Sri Lanka and India?
I mean, it's largely, it's positive. I think it's become more positive in the last few years. There's, the Sri Lankan Prime Minister and President both come here quite regularly to Delhi. There's a lot that India is actually doing there now. They might an Indian company might be investing in an airport there. There's been a lot of backing for the Sri Lankan railways as well that India has provided. So I think largely it's become a popular tourist destination for Indians. So I would say it's on a largely positive trajectory. There are concerns that the Sri Lankan economy as a whole. India benefits a lot from the Colombo port. A lot of the trade to India actually comes via Colombo now, and something that my Chinese friends point out all the time, that we actually help your economy. But there are still these concerns that the Sri Lankan economy could become over-dependent on China, and so and those concerns are often shared by people in the Sri Lankan government.
Tying back to
So India's vote in UN against Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So how would it affect anyway Israel and India relations?
I mean, I think the answer that question was asked to Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was here, and he basically said no. He said the relationship is much more important than one vote. But what was interesting about that vote, so background for all of you, there was a vote. The Trump administration said that they were going to move their recognition of the capital of Israel to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. This was welcomed in Israel but heavily criticized by others. This led to a vote to condemn this in the UN, and India voted to condemn it, along with the majority of countries, including the UK and Japan and other US allies. So a very small group of countries abstained or voted with the US. What was interesting about it was how much that vote was criticized in India. And I think it perhaps is the first time that the Indian government was criticized for being anti-Israel. It's usually criticized for being too pro-Israel. So I think that tells you in some ways the changing narrative in India. But I mean, I don't know the exact reason why India cast the vote the way it did, but many times these votes at the UN are linked to other things. So India agrees to vote this way if the US and Israel vote with India on another issue that matters more to India. So there are many complicated reasons why India votes a certain way at the UN or at any other multinational body. I mean, meaning there are multiple factors. So I don't know what the exact logic behind this time. But when Prime Minister Netanyahu was asked about it, he said that the India-Israel relationship was more important than one vote in the UN. So and clearly he came and he had a very successful visit, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Yeah, please.
Just along the lines of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
There's a lot of concerns amongst students that Donald Trump would severely affect a lot of the international system. Have you seen any of that
Right.
in India?
I'm surprised it's taken this long to get to Donald Trump. It usually is like the first question I've asked him. I just came back. I was in Washington about 2 days ago, and I have a different view from many people on this. Although I think my view is shared by many people in the U.S. government and close to the U.S. government, which is I don't think Donald Trump has actually been as disruptive as you might sense from the media. And it's not. I'm no defender of Donald Trump, by the way. I think he's a abhorrent human being. But it's just. But what I mean is, if you take out the rhetoric for a second, if you take out what he says on Twitter and look at what has actually been accomplished by him, there's very little that's not easily reversible by a future president. Again, with some exceptions and some of the immigration stuff that's still playing out, it remains to be seen. It could be quite far-reaching. But by and large, it's not been nearly as disruptive as it could have been. And in fact, on certain areas, and particularly Asia policy, I would say, I think he's even done a few things that are quite welcome. And again, it's not him, but it's actually the people around him who have. So just to give you a few examples, he's actually increased freedom of navigation operations in South China Sea, something that the Obama administration sort of hemmed and hawed about, and finally reluctantly came around to that view that we need to do this, and the Trump administration has gone ahead with it. The Afghanistan policy is basically, again, people will cringe at this, but it's actually a continuation of Obama policy, and actually a formalization of Obama's, the last 2 years of Obama's Afghanistan policy, which again I think is a welcome sign. So on a lot of things, again, I don't think this is Trump the person. It is he has some very good people around him, and sometimes they manage to do things I think behind his back. So they've just recently released a national defense strategy, which I think I'd be surprised if Trump read it, but it says a lot of things that are quite antithetical to a lot of what Trump has said publicly. Now there's some exceptions. I think they're important exceptions. One, the biggest one is on trade. So pulling out of TPP, I think, has been extremely damaging for U.S. interests. India is less affected by it than India was not part of TPP, and actually in the short term India would have been a net loser from TPP. But in the long run, I think it would have increased the level of, in a positive way, of trade competition globally, and raised standards. And I think for Australia it was a big issue, of course, and I can understand why. So I think that's been a big disappointment. And this obsession with trade deficits that he has, and China is the primary target, but Japan, India, Vietnam, South Korea have been targets as well. The second, and I think it's less damaging, is pulling out the Paris Climate Accord. It's less damaging because I think corporations and US states are actually still committed to it, and so the US will meet its targets. And so it's more rhetorical than substantive. But again, it's ceding American leadership on an important issue. The third one, which could potentially be the most damaging, but it's still playing out, is immigration. And what attitude the US takes, because ultimately US success has, the reason the US has been so much more successful than Europe over the past quarter century has basically been because of its immigration policies. And the fact that it has a system that attracts the best talent in the world in whatever field. And if that is eroded, it will have a competitive advantage to others and be a net loser, because it'll lead to retaliations. Others will put up barriers as well, and so I think that is still being negotiated because in the U.S. Congress they want more comprehensive immigration reform. It may not affect Indians as much as others, because if they replace it with a point-based system, immigration system, I suspect Indians will be amongst the biggest beneficiaries, because what they want are young, English-speaking, educated professionals, and Indians will check a lot of those boxes. So again, I think it's not that there aren't irritants in the US-India relationship with Trump. I think there have been some issues on trade, specifically, some issues related to immigration potentially, but I think on balance, I would say Trump has not been India's been one of the least negatively affected countries by Trump's assuming power. And in fact, I think the transition from Obama to Trump has been relatively smooth again for India compared to most countries. Again, I often say all of this, and people say I'm a Trump supporter, and I'm horrified at the thought.
Perfect timing. I want to wrap up with one quick question, just to bring it back to the topic and the theme of the immersion program, and that is, what role, if any, does Australia have in this volatile area, from an Indian perspective?
Yeah, good question. So I mean, I think if you look at the bilateral relationship, I think there's a great, and I'm curious to know if this came up in the Australia-India leadership dialogue yesterday and the last few days, but there's a tendency to look at all economic relations as free trade agreements. Can we enter into a free trade agreement, right? And the fact is that free trade agreements tariffs have basically gone down everywhere. I mean, with very few exceptions, India has pretty low tariffs actually, despite the trade is now about facilitating commerce inside countries. So it's become more about regulation than it has become about lowering tariffs. It's become about trade facilitation. And so I think if we want a deeper India-Australia bilateral relationship, a free trade agreement would be important, of course, but should not be kind of the holy grail that everything is. There are many other things that can be done between the two countries to facilitate a deeper relationship. Education has obviously been a big element of it. We have a very large number of Indian students in Australia, but I think there are other areas of worth exploring. I think agriculture, particularly help in agriculture productivity, where Australia has very major strengths and India has very major challenges, could be an area that's worth exploring. A lot of other things will happen much more naturally, I think, as India develops and Australia develops as well. Two, I think, while the latest Australian foreign policy white paper has a lot that we should welcome here in India, I think there's not yet a political consensus about it in Australia. And so I think if we do see a change in government, which I think might very well happen in Australia soon, whether the new government can continue many of those policies rather than reverse some of them is something I think we'll watch out for here in India. I think, again, there's a lot of room there for potential cooperation. Three, I think some understanding India, and I think that efforts like this are exactly part of that, and there are many such efforts underway, but I think the more Australians can understand India, and frankly the reverse is true, Indians can understand Australia, the better it would be. you would maybe remember this, but a few years ago, everything that was in the Indian press about Australia was that that's where students go to get beaten. And yes, there were some incidents, and it was rather poorly handled. But I mean, the idea that was the dominant image in some Indians' minds about Australia, that shouldn't be the case, obviously. So I think we have a lot to learn about each other. And finally, I think we have to understand that we do have a lot in common, right? That both parliamentary democracies, both pluralistic entities, both market economies, that there is that natural convergence, and particularly when you look around, when Australia looks around its neighborhood and extended neighborhood, and India looks around its neighborhood, there are very few other countries that meet those criteria. I mean, I would say the only other robust democracy, large robust democracies is Japan, and Japan's not quite as pluralistic and cosmopolitan and diverse as Australia or India is. So I think if we look around the region, I think we do have a lot more in common. So I think appreciating that, understanding the differences that we have with each other, creating a consensus in both countries about each other's strategic importance, and then finding ways of bilateral, particularly economic and people-to-people cooperation that is beyond the sort of headline stuff, I think would be what I would take away from it.
All right, please join me.